Hello everyone, my name is Olivier Dion. I'm a French entrepreneur and for the MyData conference this year, I'm talking to you today from Seoul, Korea, and I will explain to you a bit about what I've done in the past and what I do today, about data empowerment, data sharing, and so I will give you every detail about our action. So I created my startup that is called Onecub in 2011. I was interested in data empowerment and how people could get back power over their data. And at the same time, in Europe, we started the discussions, the early discussions about what would become the GDPR. And inside the GDPR, we had a key part of the regulation that was called data portability that would help people to share their data. So I was more interested about this because it could, in my mind, it could unleash value with data for people. The rest part of the GDPR was more about privacy protection only. But if you combine the two, then you empower people. They are more protected, but they can create value for themselves. And that's how I started my journey towards people's empowerment. At first in France with Laughing through the project Medinfo, and later on by being involved into the MyData movement. Here on this slide, you can see the timeline, the more recent timeline. So when I started my company in 2011, it was a very early process of the building of the GDPR. But here you can see that GDPR, in a sense, is kind of a reaction to the domination of the big tech, especially the US big tech, and the privacy issues that came with it. So we built the GDPR that was voted in 2016, and then it was put into application in 2018. But you see that it was not the end of it, since, and I have faced it personally. Inside GDPR, there was this right to portability. So the right for people to take their data from one digital service to another. And in my mind, that was supposed to free people and to empower people with their data. But it was not well accepted by companies, by organizations. They were fearing that people would be more free with their data. They were fearing that, for instance, competition would access their data. And in a context of the GDPR, they were worried about fines with the GDPR. They were worried about the regulator action, and they didn't want to open up their data. The organization, the companies, they didn't want to open up their data. So we were stuck. We were stuck with this topic of data portability. It was a dead end, simply put, and we could not make progress on it. So that's why just after the GDPR, in 2019 and 2020, we started to work, and I was involved with it through MyData. We started to work with the European Commission on the data strategy, the European data strategy. And here the idea was not, unlike the GDPR, was not just about data protection. Here the idea was about value and sharing. So we were not talking about data portability anymore. We were talking about data sharing. And this was not just about personal data sharing. It was both personal data sharing and non-personal data sharing. So two at the same time. The European Commission had understood at this stage that it was about value creation, and so it was about sharing. Data is valuable when it's shared. And it was very interesting to me because this was solving the issue I had with the GDPR, where protection was the only focus for policymakers and for organizations. So we had this data strategy, which was a simple piece of text that was paving the way for future regulation. And this is where we are now today. We are in the process. I show you this. We are in the process of building a new regulation. We could say GDPR Part 2, with you see the 4 blocks here. So you've got the Data Governance Act, Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, and Data Act. All of them combined, they give Europe a framework for sharing data in a fair environment. And we still have the GDPR to protect people's privacy. And also we completed the GDPR, especially in the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, with new protections for people. So I was very happy with this new data strategy and this new set of text that was putting in place a framework for creating value with data and really empowering people with their data. To me, if you just protect privacy, you do not empower people. The data are still owned by big tech, not by people, and people never reap the benefits of their own data. So I'm very happy with this new set of texts, and we are in the middle of the process for this new regulation text. But it's not enough. If you just have regulations with data, and you still have the big tech owning the technologies, then it is still arm wrestling between the regulator in Europe and the big tech, for instance, in the US. So we saw that in Europe, and it starts with Europe, but it's way bigger now. And if I'm in Korea, it's also for preparing this worldwide collaboration. But the idea is we need, on top of this regulation, we need to have standards that will implement in a way that will implement the regulation into the technology. And that's why we created an association in Europe called Gaia-X. And now Gaia-X is more than Europe. We partner with Korea and Japan. And inside Gaia-X, we discuss standards for sharing data that are compliant with the regulation. And thanks to those standards, the idea is that we build data sharing ecosystems in all sectors of the economy. And you can see here, it was an early schema of what the European Commission had in mind about data sharing. You can see here the priority for the European Commission, priority sectors for building what Europe calls data spaces. Basically, a data space is a data sharing ecosystem where you have companies, administrations that group together to make possible the sharing of personal and non-personal data. They can put in place the sharing of their users' personal data. And you can build data space in every country and in all sectors, basically. And here on the schema, you can see the first sectors that the European Commission had in mind when it pushed the concept of data spaces. For instance, you've got skills, you've got mobility, you've got finance, you've got agriculture, and so on and so on. And this is really a new concept invented by the Germans in the context of the Industry 4.0. the data spaces is really a concept that is the basis, the core of the new European data strategy. And for building, so that's the link between what I said previously, for building those data spaces, those data sharing ecosystems, we will rely on common standard built inside Gaia X that sit on top of the regulation. So that's the articulation between all of this. And with MyData, so we participated into, we are still participating into the Gaia X building. But with a heavy focus, that the role of MyData, with a heavy focus on personal data sharing. It's not all personal in Gaia X. And you can imagine that since Gaia X comes from, and the data spaces, they come from Industry 4.0, they are not specifically personal data oriented. So we had, with MyData, our role was to push every ID associated to personal data sharing and human centricity also. So that's what we did with MyData inside Gaia X, and Gaia X is helping us at the moment to create those data spaces and the data spaces standards. So here it's the regulation. Here a bit more about the data spaces. You can see on the schema on the left side that you get the world that we have today. So it's a very centralized world where you've got very few entry points on the internet, like search engines, for instance, social networks, or you get also big platforms, like for instance, highly involved in the tourism sector, and you have, for instance, Booking.com in the tourism sector. That is a key entry point on the internet. You also have some big companies, and that's pretty much it. You can access the web through very few organizations, and that leads to many problems. You have an unfair market with companies that are that capture most of the value. You've got a lot of very small players that have a hard time to exist on the internet, and that will depend a lot on the big platforms. You have of course the privacy issues that we've seen over the past few years with big tech, that's you've got monopolies or oligopolies everywhere in all sectors on the internet, and that's what we have today with this centralized internet. What we want to achieve with the data spaces, what we want to build, is a more decentralized internet with either organizations and people in control of their data. So we want them to circulate their data around between their digital services. And so this way, we hope that we will be able to create decentralized, fair, and human-centric data ecosystems. We will, at the same time, with more control, we will reduce privacy issues. We will also reduce domination from a small group of players. We will try to create fair business environments where the value of data will be more distributed throughout the players. And that's the idea. We will also create, what we want to create is data value chains, meaning data will circulate from one service to another, to another, to another, to another, and the value will grow along the data value chain. So that's it. That's what we want to create. And for this, our main concept, our main tool is what we call the data spaces. Okay. So here is a slide about what you need to build those data spaces. So in any sector, be it in agriculture, education, healthcare, or whatever, the idea of a data space is you first group organizations or people that want to share data between one another. They say, okay, and they first design the governance, meaning the rules for sharing data between one another. But then, of course, they need a technical infrastructure to share the data. And this infrastructure will have to rely on regulations and standards. You can see them on the right. So you can retrieve, you have MyData, you have Gaia-X, for instance. You've got the EU Commission or the local, it can be in Korea, it can be the local regulation. You have to implement the regulation. And you got other organizations providing standards for sharing data. And you will reuse the standards and develop an infrastructure for sharing data. And you can see that this infrastructure will be quite complex. You've got many topics to address with this infrastructure. So you can see the 6 topics in blue in the middle of the screen. You've got to address, for instance, identity. When I say identity, it's the identity for people, but also for organizations. You've got, if you want to build trust in a data space, in a data sharing ecosystem, you've got to be able to understand, to know who you're sharing your data with. So that's a key problem. And we've got advanced concepts for this, for instance, called, for those who've heard about it, self-sovereign identity. So this is the advanced concept. But in general, we've got to make sure to know the identity of the stakeholders of the data space. Then you've got, of course, technical issues like handling data models, APIs, data processing, and so on. Also, you've got the notion of consent, which is key, especially for personal data sharing. Consent means that in a data space, if you're, for instance, I want to share my data with this organization, between this organization and this organization, I will give my consent for sharing my data. And in this consent, there will be a finality attached to the sharing of my data, meaning I will share this data for this specific use case. And at any time, I can withdraw my consent. I can take it back. So that's how, through the notion of consent and as we materialize it inside the data space, we give more control to the individual. And we develop it inside the infrastructure of the data space. We allow the use of the notion of consent. You also see legal aspects. So consent, I put this apart, but consent is a part of the legal framework of a data space. But you also need tools to handle the legal aspects of a data space. For instance, there will be contracts between organizations when they share data. And you want liability in a data space. You want people to, you want especially organizations to be liable when they share data, and we put in place in the infrastructure the tools for them to achieve it. Then you've got the notion of value sharing. That can be money exchange, financial exchange happening inside a data space. It's not mandatory. Data can be shared between stakeholders for free, but it happens. It's important, and we got to make it possible. It's okay in the regulation we talk about it. It's okay to compensate the sharing of data, but you see that many questions will arise building those data value chains. And finally, you see the topic of governance. The idea of a data space is that the stakeholders of the data space determine their own rules for sharing. For instance, those rules could be about reciprocity when sharing data. I share this kind of data with you if you share it with me. They can be about matching. When you match a person's profile with an offer, there might be different ways to do it, etc., etc. But we want, basically, we're building a decentralized autonomous organization. For those who know about blockchain, this is really like the blockchain mindset and the Web3 mindset. And I would add that for all those key issues, technical issues of the data space, it's not mandatory, but you can have Web3 technologies. And at the moment, all over Europe and in other countries, we are developing Web3 technologies for the data space, for the data spaces. Okay, here we are talking about something else, about how we build more fairer ecosystems, data ecosystems. On the left, you can see what we have today. Today, we've got digital services that most of the time put their data on a cloud. Most of the time, it's a big tech cloud. For instance, Microsoft Azure, or Amazon, or Google, or IBM, and so on. And they use this cloud not only for storing data, but they also access a lot of different kinds of high-value services to process data, to handle AI, and so on and so on. And they do this in a silo. They stay within their cloud provider, and we've got, and it's hard, it's barely interoperable with other cloud provider. And for instance, let's take, for instance, the healthcare domain. You can have, for instance, your Philips, and you want to share data with Pfizer, but Philips, it's not true, but it's an example. Imagine Philips is on Google and Pfizer is on Amazon. It will be hard to build data sharing use cases and to build value together between the two companies. What we are doing here with the data spaces is that we are building data sharing infrastructure through interoperability across the clouds, across the cloud providers. We build a layer on top of the cloud provider, and so we are disintermediating the cloud providers, and we are helping to horizontalize the sharing of value. And so that's what we do, the strategy we have. Of course, this will involve the cloud providers, but we are kind of disrupting their actual model. Here, you can see an example of what I'm working on at the moment, especially with Onecub. So we are working on the tourism data space in Europe. We are involved in a tourism data space in France called Themis. And within Themis, we are also involved at the European level. We are partnering with all the other tourism data spaces being built at the moment all over Europe. And the idea is kind of always the same, is empowering the traveler. We put, in a sense, tools for sharing the trip's data. And this way, he will have benefit from a seamless user experience. You know that when you travel, you've got to take a train, a plane, book a hotel, book some activities, metro tickets, and so on and so on. So you've got tons of applications on your smartphone, and here you will feel like you've got just one application to handle, since your data will flow between one application and another in a seamless manner. For instance, you will put only once your payment data, your identity data, passport data, and so on and so on. But also, the more you will use the system, the more it will know you without endangering your privacy. But since it will know you more, you will be able to benefit from AI augmented services that will guide you throughout your trip. For instance, it will understand that it will understand your food preferences. It will understand that you want to travel green with green mobility, green activities, and so on. And it will help you. It will guide you. It will act like a travel assistant for you, but a decentralized travel assistant. So that's what we are building at the moment with Themis. Here I put a little focus on the general experience when you share personal data through consent. So it has to be very easy, and we are trying to build it the same way all over the world now. So if you want, here you've got an example between application, so service 1 and service 2. You want to share your data between service 1 and service 2. Basically, you have to authenticate to service 1. It's point 1. Then you give your consent to send data from service 1 to service 2, point 2. Then point 3, you authenticate to service 3. And point 4, you go to service 2 and you see your data coming from service 1. And apart from this, point 5, you can access all the consents you gave, all the controls, so consent you gave for sharing your data in a dashboard, in an e-wallet with all your consents. And here, but maybe if you've got some time for it, you can see the details of the infrastructure we are building within GaiaX. And I want to add also that I'm the co-founder of an association based in Brussels called A New Governance. When we gathered with A New Governance, many entrepreneurs that are building tools for sharing data. And what we believe is all those players of the industry, they should build a new layer that we call the infratech. The infratech is mostly startups working, for instance, on consent management, trustworthy AI, on data marketplace, and so on and so on. So you see in this schema, we do not go into details, but there are many features for data space, and all those features, they do not have to come from one player only. They can come from many startups. And so we call for the grouping of those startups into infrastructure offers. Let's AI startups focus on AI. Let's consent startups focus on consent, but let's group together to be able to propose infrastructure offers that are the aggregation of all the talents of those stakeholders. Thanks a lot for listening to my presentation. So that was Olivier Dion, CEO of Onecub, a startup based in Paris working on data sharing, data spaces, and human-centric data economy. So feel free to contact me. You can see my email address here, Olivier at onecub.fr. I'm very happy. I would be very happy to answer to you, and very happy to be today in Seoul, Korea, to participate in this 2022 MyData conference.